In December 1974, a Soviet passenger ship departed from Vladivostok on a cruise across the Pacific Ocean. The voyage was presented as an unusual but carefully controlled form of tourism. Unlike international cruises, the ship was not scheduled to dock in any foreign ports. The entire route passed through international waters before returning to the Soviet Union. For the authorities, this design solved a problem. Passengers would experience the idea of travel without ever leaving the country. Before departure, passports were collected and stored by ship administration. Movement on board was unrestricted, but the overall structure of the voyage ensured that no contact with foreign territory was possible. Among the passengers was Stanislav Kurilov, a trained oceanographer employed in Soviet scientific institutions. Kurilov had spent years working in marine research. His professional interests were directly connected to the open ocean, international expeditions, and long-term scientific projects. Despite this, he was repeatedly denied permission to travel abroad. The reasons were never explained in detail. In the Soviet administrative system, refusal required no justification. A person could be labeled as unreliable without formal charges, without investigation, and without any defined path to appeal. Once that label was applied, it followed indefinitely. Kurilov continued working, continued submitting requests, and continued receiving the same answer. The cruise was not intended as a chance to leave the country. It was designed specifically to prevent that. There were no rescue boats prepared for independent use, no planned stops, and no infrastructure for disembarkation at sea. Nevertheless, Kurilov viewed the voyage differently. As an oceanographer, he understood currents, distances, and physical limits. He was aware that the ship would pass within reach of island groups in the Western Pacific. He also understood the risks involved in entering open water from a moving vessel. The decision to jump was not made during the cruise itself. It was the result of long preparation. Kurilov trained his endurance. He studied navigation by stars and sun. He considered water temperature, expected weather conditions, and the physiological limits of prolonged swimming. He prepared a minimal set of equipment that could be concealed on board. There was no guarantee that the plan would succeed. A jump from a cruise ship at speed carried immediate risks. Turbulence near the hull could pull a swimmer under. Separation from the ship meant instant isolation. Even a successful entry into the water offered no certainty of reaching land. Despite this, Kurilov concluded that the voyage represented his only realistic opportunity. On the night of December 13th, as the ship moved steadily through the Pacific, he chose his moment based on position, lighting, and sea conditions. There was no signal, no assistance, and no contingency plan beyond what he carried on his body. When he entered the water, the ship continued forward without slowing. From the deck, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. No alarm was raised, no search was initiated. Within minutes, the vessel disappeared beyond the horizon. Kurilov remained alone in open water, beginning a journey that would last several days and test the limits of physical endurance and survival. The escape, once initiated, could no longer be reversed. The preparation for the escape did not begin on board the ship. It began years earlier. Kurilov's professional background played a critical role in shaping his plan. As an oceanographer, he was trained to think in terms of currents, distances, and environmental conditions rather than fixed routes or borders. For him, the ocean was not an abstract barrier, but a physical system that could be studied and, under certain conditions, navigated. He understood that swimming long distances in open water was not a matter of strength alone. Endurance, pacing, orientation, and energy management were far more important than speed. Survival depended on conserving resources rather than expending them quickly. Long before the cruise, Kurilov began preparing his body for prolonged exposure to water. He trained his breathing and swimming technique to minimize energy loss. He practiced floating for extended periods to reduce fatigue. He studied how the human body responds to dehydration, saltwater exposure, and temperature changes over time. Equally important was mental preparation. Swimming in open water without visual reference points requires the ability to tolerate uncertainty. There is no shoreline to aim for, no guarantee of progress that can be immediately verified. Disorientation, especially at night, can cause swimmers to waste energy correcting imaginary errors in direction. Kurilov worked to reduce this risk by training himself to rely on slow, consistent movement and periodic rest rather than constant forward motion. Navigation posed another challenge. He could not carry maps or instruments without attracting attention. Instead, he relied on basic celestial navigation and an understanding of how prevailing currents behaved in the region the ship would traverse. His goal was not to reach a precise point, but to remain within a moving system that would eventually carry him toward land. Equipment had to be minimal. Anything visible or bulky could raise suspicion before the jump or become a liability afterward. Kurilov prepared only what he could conceal and manage while swimming. Swim fins to improve efficiency, basic flotation aids, and a small amount of personal equipment secured to his body. There was no food supply sufficient for several days and no freshwater reserve beyond what could be carried discreetly. He accepted that dehydration would become a serious problem and that survival would depend on reaching land before physical collapse. Timing was critical. Jumping too early in the voyage would place him too far from land. Jumping too late risked detection or unfavorable conditions. Kurilov monitored the ship's progress, estimating position based on time, speed, and direction. He also observed the ship's routines. Lighting patterns, crew movements, and passenger activity influenced when it would be possible to leave the deck unnoticed. A successful jump required a moment when visibility was low and attention elsewhere. The plan allowed no margin for error. If he misjudged the distance, he would drift indefinitely. If he misjudged the current, he could be carried away from land. If he exhausted himself too quickly, there would be no recovery. Despite these uncertainties, Kurilov concluded that waiting carried its own risk. Remaining within the Soviet system meant continued restriction, continued denial of professional opportunities, and no realistic prospect of legal departure. The cruise, though designed to prevent escape, offered a narrow window in which the ocean itself could be used as a route rather than an obstacle. By the time the ship reached the section of the Pacific he had identified as viable, Kurilov's preparation was complete. The remaining variables, weather, currents, and physical limits, could not be controlled. They could only be faced. The moment of departure was defined more by calculation than by emotion. Kurilov waited for conditions that minimized immediate risk. The ship maintained a steady course and speed. Sea state was moderate, with no heavy swell that could complicate entry into the water. Darkness reduced visibility from the deck, and passenger activity had largely subsided. He chose a position along the railing that allowed him to enter the water clear of the ship's structure. Jumping from a moving vessel carries specific dangers. Turbulence near the hull can pull a swimmer under the ship, where contact with the propellers is often fatal. To avoid this, the jump had to be timed so that forward momentum carried him away from the hull rather than beneath it. When he entered the water, the impact was controlled but forceful. The ship continued forward without change in speed. Within seconds, the distance between swimmer and vessel increased beyond any possibility of return. There was no attempt to attract attention, no signal, and no expectation that anyone would notice. Kurilov focused immediately on stabilizing his position. The first priority was to move away from the wake, where turbulent water could drain energy and complicate orientation. Once clear, he adjusted his pace to a sustainable rhythm designed to conserve strength rather than maximize distance. At this stage, the objective was not landfall. It was survival through the first hours. Open ocean swimming differs significantly from coastal swimming. There are no visual reference points, and the sense of motion is subtle. Without landmarks, it is easy to overestimate or underestimate progress. Kurilov relied on timekeeping and body awareness rather than visual confirmation. Night navigation presented additional challenges. Cloud cover obscured stars intermittently, limiting the usefulness of celestial reference. In these conditions, maintaining a general heading was more important than precision. The goal was to remain within the broader current system that could eventually carry him toward land. Fatigue developed gradually. Swimming fins increased efficiency, but also required continuous leg motion. Kurilov alternated between active swimming and floating periods to reduce muscle exhaustion. Floating on his back allowed partial rest while maintaining orientation and conserving energy. Exposure became a growing concern. Even in relatively warm water, prolonged immersion leads to heat loss. Saltwater irritation affected eyes and skin. Dehydration began almost immediately as exertion increased fluid loss without any means of replacement. The psychological environment was as demanding as the physical one. Isolation at sea removes external feedback. There is no confirmation that progress is being made, no indication of distance covered, and no assurance that conditions will remain stable. Maintaining routine and structure became essential to prevent disorientation and panic. Kurilov established a simple internal schedule: swim, float, orient, rest. Repeating this cycle provided continuity and reduced the mental strain of uncertainty. By daylight, the scale of the situation became clearer. The ship was long gone. The horizon was uninterrupted. The ocean extended in all directions, offering no visible indication of proximity to land. From this point forward, success depended on endurance and navigation rather than opportunity. Despite the absence of landmarks, Kurilov continued in the direction he had planned. Turning back was not possible. Changing course significantly would only increase uncertainty. The first day ended without incident. No vessels appeared. No land was visible. What had begun as a calculated entry into the water had now become a sustained effort to remain functional over an extended period. The distance to safety remained unknown. By the second day in the water, the primary challenge was no longer distance, but depletion. Kurilov had anticipated exhaustion, but dehydration progressed faster than expected. Continuous exposure to salt water increased fluid loss through the skin, while physical exertion accelerated dehydration even during periods of rest. With no access to fresh water, every hour increased physiological stress. Saltwater contact caused irritation to the eyes and mouth. Accidental ingestion during waves worsened thirst rather than relieving it. Kurilov avoided swallowing seawater as much as possible, understanding that it would accelerate dehydration and lead to disorientation. Energy conservation became critical. He reduced active swimming to the minimum required to maintain direction and relied more heavily on floating. By remaining horizontal and minimizing movement, he could slow fatigue and preserve body heat. Periods of motionless floating alternated with short intervals of swimming to correct drift. Sleep was fragmented. True rest in open water is impossible. Kurilov allowed himself brief moments of partial sleep while floating, waking frequently to reorient and resume controlled movement. The lack of continuous rest accumulated into mental fatigue, making concentration increasingly difficult. Sun exposure introduced additional complications. During daylight hours, direct sunlight intensified dehydration and increased body temperature. Kurilov adjusted his position to minimize exposure, keeping his face and upper body partially submerged when possible. Even so, prolonged exposure without hydration placed significant strain on the body. Navigation remained approximate. Without instruments, precise course correction was not feasible. Kurilov focused on maintaining general alignment with prevailing currents rather than rigid directional control. The objective was not to reach a specific point, but to remain within a flow that would eventually lead toward land. Psychological pressure intensified during this phase. The absence of visual progress created uncertainty. Each hour passed without confirmation that the plan was working. Mental discipline became as important as physical endurance. Kurilov avoided focusing on total distance or time remaining, instead concentrating on immediate tasks, maintaining position, conserving energy, and remaining conscious. Hallucinations began intermittently. Extended dehydration, sleep deprivation, and sensory monotony can distort perception. Kurilov later described moments when shapes appeared on the horizon that vanished upon closer observation. Recognizing these as symptoms rather than signs of failure helped him avoid impulsive changes in direction. Despite these difficulties, physical function remained intact. Muscle fatigue was present but manageable. Breathing remained controlled. Orientation, while imperfect, was sufficient to prevent panic. These indicators suggested that survival was still possible, provided conditions did not deteriorate suddenly. The second night passed without incident. By the third day, Kurilov understood that the margin for error was narrowing. Any injury, cramp, or sudden weather change could end the attempt. At the same time, continued effort increased the probability that landfall would occur before complete physical collapse. The strategy remained unchanged. Move when necessary, float when possible. Avoid unnecessary exertion. What had begun as a calculated escape had now become a prolonged endurance exercise governed by physiology rather than planning. Land was still not visible, but the ocean no longer felt infinite. On the third day in the water, changes in the environment became noticeable. Wave patterns shifted, and the movement of the water felt less uniform. Floating debris appeared intermittently, fragments of vegetation and small objects that do not normally remain far from land for extended periods. These signs did not indicate proximity in precise terms, but they suggested that Kurilov had entered a different part of the ocean system. Energy reserves were critically low. Dehydration had progressed to the point where muscle coordination required conscious effort. Swimming efficiency decreased, and recovery during floating periods became slower. Kurilov adjusted his pace further, accepting reduced speed in exchange for maintaining basic function. At this stage, the risk of sudden collapse was significant. Extended exposure, lack of sleep, and electrolyte imbalance increased the likelihood of cramps and loss of motor control. Kurilov responded by limiting movement to essential corrections only, allowing the water to carry him whenever possible. Land became visible later that day. At first, it appeared as a faint horizontal irregularity near the edge of the horizon. Confirmation required time. Distance at sea is difficult to judge, and dehydration can distort perception. Only after maintaining the same bearing for an extended period did the outline remain stable enough to be accepted as real. The approach to shore introduced new dangers. Near coastal waters, wave behavior becomes less predictable. Currents can reverse direction, and surf can exhaust a swimmer more quickly than open water. Kurilov timed his movement to avoid fighting incoming waves directly, allowing periods of drift to carry him closer before making controlled efforts forward. Contact with the seabed occurred unexpectedly. After days without solid reference, the sensation of ground beneath the feet required adjustment. Standing too quickly risked collapse due to circulatory strain. Kurilov moved slowly, stabilizing himself before attempting to walk. He reached land on a small island within the Philippine archipelago. Local inhabitants discovered him shortly afterward. Communication was limited, but his physical condition made the situation clear. Assistance was provided, and he was given water and basic care. Medical attention followed once he was transported to a larger settlement. Recovery was gradual. Severe dehydration, exhaustion, and prolonged saltwater exposure required extended treatment. Despite this, Kurilov had avoided critical injury. The most dangerous phase, survival at sea, had ended. The political consequences unfolded separately. In the Soviet Union, the cruise continued and returned as scheduled. Kurilov's absence was noted only after arrival. The official explanation provided to authorities and family members was that he had fallen overboard and drowned. No search was conducted. Public acknowledgement was unnecessary. From the state's perspective, the case was closed. Kurilov did not return. After recovery, he sought asylum and later settled abroad, continuing his scientific work. Years later, he documented his experience in writing, providing one of the rare first-hand accounts of an escape carried out without assistance, transportation, or institutional support. The method was neither repeatable nor encouraged. It relied on exceptional physical preparation, favorable conditions, and a willingness to accept risks that offered no possibility of rescue. For most, such an attempt would have ended differently. In this case, it did not. The escape succeeded not because it was safe, but because it was possible.